Sarah Mitchell had always been proud of her quiet neighborhood on Elm Street. The tree-lined roads and well-kept houses made it the perfect place to raise her two young children, Emma and Jake. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital, often pulling long shifts, but she never worried about leaving her kids with Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor who had become like family over the years. Everything changed on a cold Tuesday evening in November. Sarah had just returned home from a particularly exhausting shift when she heard it, a dog barking frantically from somewhere nearby. At first, she didn't pay much attention. Dogs bark all the time, and living in a residential area meant dealing with the occasional noise from pets. But this wasn't ordinary barking. This was desperate, urgent, and it wouldn't stop. The sound seemed to be coming from the house directly across the street, a modest two-story home painted pale blue with white shutters. Sarah had noticed the family who lived there, a young couple with a small daughter, maybe around Emma's age. They seemed nice enough, always waving when they saw each other getting mail or working in their yards. The husband, David, was tall and thin with dark hair, while his wife Rebecca was petite with blonde hair that she often wore in a ponytail. Their daughter, Lily, looked to be about 7 years old. As Sarah prepared dinner for her children, the barking continued. It was coming from what appeared to be a medium-sized dog, though she had never actually seen the animal. The family across the street kept their dog indoors most of the time, but the sound was clearly audible through their windows. What troubled Sarah most was the tone of the barking. She had grown up with dogs and understood their different vocalizations. This wasn't the playful bark of a dog wanting attention, or the territorial bark of a dog protecting its home. This was the sound of an animal in distress. "Mom, what's wrong with that dog?" Emma asked, looking up from her homework at the kitchen table. The 8-year-old had noticed the incessant noise too, and it was clearly bothering her. "I'm not sure, sweetheart," Sarah replied, stirring the pasta sauce while glancing out the window toward the house across the street. Maybe it's just excited about something. But even as she said the words, Sarah didn't believe them. She had been listening to this particular pattern of barking for over an hour now, and it showed no signs of stopping. The dog would bark rapidly for several minutes, then pause briefly as if listening, then start again with even more urgency. It reminded her of the way her childhood dog used to bark when something was seriously wrong, like the time their neighbor's house had caught fire, or when a burglar had tried to break into their garage. Jake, her 5-year-old son, wandered into the kitchen rubbing his eyes. "The doggy is being too loud," he complained. "I can't watch my cartoons." Sarah realized that if the barking was bothering her children inside their house, it must be incredibly loud for anyone actually in the house across the street. She wondered how the family was dealing with it. Maybe the dog was sick or injured. Perhaps she should go over and check if they needed help or wanted her to call a veterinarian. As a nurse, she was always ready to help in medical emergencies, and this felt like some kind of emergency. After getting her children settled with their dinner, Sarah decided to take a closer look. She stepped out onto her front porch, wrapping her cardigan tightly around herself against the cold evening air. The barking was much clearer from outside, and it was definitely coming from the blue house across the street. She could see lights on in several windows, which meant the family was home. How were they tolerating this noise? What struck her as odd was that she couldn't see any movement in the house despite the dog's obvious distress. Usually, when a dog is barking frantically, owners will try to calm it down or figure out what's wrong. They might come to windows, go outside to check, or at least turn on additional lights to investigate. But the house across the street remained still, as if no one was paying attention to their pet's urgent cries. Sarah stood on her porch for nearly 20 minutes, watching and listening. The pattern never changed. The dog would bark intensely for 3 to 4 minutes, pause for about 30 seconds, then start again. During the brief quiet moments, Sarah strained to hear any other sounds, voices, footsteps, doors opening or closing, but there was nothing. Just the eerie silence before the barking resumed. As the evening grew darker and colder, Sarah began to feel genuinely concerned. Something wasn't right about this situation. In her years as a nurse, she had developed strong instincts about when something was wrong, and every fiber of her being was telling her that this wasn't a simple case of a misbehaving pet. The dog's barking had a quality of desperation that made her think of emergency room situations, where patients couldn't speak but were trying, Desperately to communicate that they needed help, she thought about walking across the street and knocking on the door, but something held her back. Maybe it was the unusual stillness of the house, or the way the barking seemed to echo in the quiet neighborhood like a warning. Instead, she went back inside and called her sister Linda, who lived a few blocks away. "Linda, I know this might sound crazy, but there's a dog across the street that's been barking nonstop for almost 2 hours," Sarah explained. "It sounds really distressed and I can't see anyone in the house trying to help it." "Maybe they're not home," Linda suggested practically. "But all the lights are on," Sarah replied, peering out her living room window again. "And their car's in the driveway. They have to be home. Well, maybe they're just ignoring it. Some people don't pay much attention to their pets." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. As she tucked her children into bed that night, the barking was still continuing. Emma asked again about the dog, and Sarah found herself making up a story about how maybe it was trying to protect its family from a raccoon in the yard. But deep down, she was becoming more and more convinced that the dog was trying to tell them something important, something that couldn't wait until morning. Sarah barely slept that night. Every time she started to drift off, the barking would pierce through her dreams and jolt her awake. She found herself getting up repeatedly to look out her bedroom window at the house across the street. The lights remained on throughout the night, but she never saw a single shadow move past any of the windows. By 3 a.m., the barking had taken on an almost hoarse quality, as if the poor animal was wearing out its voice, but it refused to give up. When morning finally came, Sarah was exhausted and worried. She had to be at the hospital by 7 a.m. for her shift, but she couldn't stop thinking about the dog. As she prepared breakfast for Emma and Jake, she kept glancing out the kitchen window. The barking had finally stopped around 5 a.m., leaving an eerie silence that somehow felt even more unsettling than the noise had been. Mrs. Henderson arrived right on time to watch the children, as she had been doing for the past 3 years. The 72-year-old woman was sharp as a tack and noticed immediately that something was bothering Sarah. "You look terrible, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, settling her purse on the kitchen counter. "Rough night at work yesterday?" "No, it wasn't work," Sarah explained, pouring coffee for both of them. "There was a dog barking all night across the street. It just stopped about 2 hours ago, but something feels wrong about the whole situation." Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years and knew everyone's business better than most people knew their own. "You mean the Kowalski family? David and Rebecca?" Sarah was surprised that Mrs. Henderson knew their names. She had never been particularly social with the neighbors beyond friendly waves and occasional small talk. "Yes, that's them. Do you know them well?" "Well enough," Mrs. Henderson replied, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Rebecca used to come over sometimes when they first moved in about 2 years ago. Sweet girl, but seemed nervous about everything, always apologizing for little things that didn't need apologies. And David?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "David seemed like the type of man who liked things done his way." There was something in Mrs. Henderson's tone that made Sarah pay closer attention. "What do you mean?" "Oh, I don't like to gossip," the older woman said, but then continued anyway. "But I did notice that Rebecca stopped coming around after a few months, and lately I rarely see her outside at all. Just David and the little girl. Lily, she's a quiet child, very polite when I see her, but she never seems to play outside like other kids her age." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. "When was the last time you saw Rebecca?" Mrs. Henderson thought for a moment. "You know, I can't quite remember. Maybe a couple of weeks ago. She was getting mail from the mailbox, but she hurried back inside when she saw me coming out to get my own mail. Usually she would wave and say hello." As Sarah drove to work, Mrs. Henderson's words kept echoing in her mind. She tried to remember the last time she had seen Rebecca herself. Now that she thought about it, she realized she had only been seeing David and Lily for the past few weeks. David would leave every morning around 8 a.m. in his blue sedan, presumably heading to work. Lily would wait at the bus stop with other neighborhood children, but she always stood a little apart from them, never chatting or laughing like the others did. At the hospital, Sarah found it difficult to concentrate on her patients. During her lunch break, she called Mrs. Henderson to check on the children and ask if the barking had started again. "No barking today," Mrs. Henderson reported, "but I did see something odd. David came home around lunchtime, which is unusual. He was only there for about 20 minutes, then left again. And Sarah, he was carrying a large black garbage bag out to his car. It looked heavy. Sarah's nursing instincts went into high alert. A garbage bag? Where did he put it? In his trunk. Then he drove off toward the main road instead of going back to work. The rest of Sarah's shift passed in a blur of worry and speculation. She kept thinking about Rebecca's absence, the dog's desperate barking, and now David's strange midday trip home with a heavy garbage bag. When she finally got home at 6 p.m., the first thing she did was look across the street at the Kowalski house. Everything appeared normal on the surface. The lights were on, David's car was back in the driveway, and she could see Lily's small figure moving past one of the upstairs windows. But there was no sign of Rebecca, and more importantly, there was no sound from the dog that had been barking so frantically just hours before. Mrs. Henderson was waiting with more information when Sarah came inside. "I kept an eye on things like you asked," she said quietly, making sure Emma and Jake couldn't hear from the living room where they were watching television. That little girl Lily came home from school on the bus as usual, but when she got to the front door, she stood there for almost 5 minutes before going in, like she was afraid to enter her own house. Afraid? Sarah felt her stomach tighten. That's what it looked like to me. She kept looking around like she was hoping someone else would come help her or something. Finally, her father opened the door from inside. I couldn't see his face clearly from here, but his body language looked angry. Sarah made dinner for her children, but she barely tasted her own food. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing out the window at the house across the street. The silence where the dog's barking had been was more disturbing than the noise had been. Animals don't usually stop making noise unless something has happened to them. And combined with Rebecca's mysterious absence, the picture forming in Sarah's mind was becoming more and more frightening. After putting Emma and Jake to bed, Sarah sat in her dark living room with just one lamp on, watching the Kowalski house through her sheer curtains. Around 9 p.m., she saw David's silhouette move past the kitchen window. He appeared to be cleaning something, moving back and forth with what looked like paper towels or cleaning cloths. The kitchen light was bright enough that she could see his movements clearly, and there was something methodical and urgent about the way he was working. At 10 p.m., David came outside and spent nearly an hour hosing down his driveway and the area around his garbage cans. Sarah thought this was strange behavior for a cold November night. Who cleans their driveway at 10 p.m. in near-freezing weather? And why would someone need to hose down concrete unless they were trying to wash something away? As she watched David work in the darkness, illuminated only by his porch light and the beam of a flashlight he kept setting down and picking up, Sarah realized she couldn't ignore her instincts any longer. Something terrible had happened in that house, and she was possibly the only person who had noticed the warning signs. The dog had been trying to tell them something, and now the dog was silent. Rebecca was nowhere to be seen, and David was acting like someone trying to cover up evidence of something awful. She knew what she had to do, even though the thought terrified her. Tomorrow, she would have to call the police. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest. She had made her decision during the sleepless hours of the night, but making the actual phone call felt overwhelming. What if she was wrong? What if there was a perfectly innocent explanation for everything she had observed? What if Rebecca was just visiting family, and David had simply taken their dog to the vet or to stay with friends? But as she got ready for work, Sarah kept coming back to the same troubling facts. The dog's desperate barking for hours, then sudden silence. Rebecca's unexplained absence for weeks. David's strange behavior with the garbage bag and the late-night cleaning. Lily's apparent fear of entering her own home. Put together, these details painted a picture that Sarah couldn't ignore, even if she desperately wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. She decided to call the police from work during her break, thinking it might be easier to speak to them from the hospital where she felt more professional and confident. But first, she wanted to gather as much information as possible. She called Mrs. Henderson and asked her to pay extra attention to the house across the street during the day. "I want you to write down anything you see," Sarah instructed. "What time David leaves, if he comes back, if you see Lily or Rebecca. If there are any delivery trucks or visitors, anything at all that seems unusual." Mrs. Henderson, who had raised 5 children and worked as a school secretary for 30 years, understood immediately that this was serious. "Sarah, do you think something bad has happened to Rebecca?" "I honestly don't know," Sarah replied. "But my gut is telling me that something is very wrong, and I can't shake the feeling that the dog was trying to warn us about it." At 11 a.m. during her break, Sarah sat in her car in the hospital parking lot. and dialed the non-emergency number for the local police department. Her hands were shaking as she waited for someone to answer. Millfield Police Department, Officer Rodriguez speaking. Hi, I'd like to report. Well, I'm not sure exactly what to report, Sarah began nervously. I think something might be wrong at my neighbor's house, but I don't have proof of anything specific. Can you tell me what's concerning you? Officer Rodriguez asked patiently. Sarah took a deep breath and explained everything. The night of desperate barking, Rebecca's absence, David's strange behavior, Lily's apparent fear, and the sudden silence of the dog. As she spoke, she realized how circumstantial it all sounded. She was reporting suspicious behavior based on observations through her window and conversations with another neighbor. Ma'am, I understand your concern, Officer Rodriguez said when she finished. Can you give me the address of the house you're worried about? Sarah provided the address on Elm Street and her own contact information. Officer Rodriguez told her that they would send someone to do a welfare check, which involved knocking on the door and making sure everyone in the household was safe and accounted for. When would someone go over there? Sarah asked. Probably later today or tomorrow. We'll have an officer stop by and just check that everything is okay. If there's nothing wrong, it's a quick visit. If there are any concerns, we'll investigate further. Sarah thanked him and hung up, feeling both relieved and anxious. She had done the right thing by calling, but now she worried about what would happen next. What if David became angry about the police visit? What if it put Lily in more danger? What if Rebecca really was just away visiting family and came home to find out that the neighbors had called the cops on her husband? The rest of her shift dragged by slowly. Sarah found herself checking her phone constantly, hoping for an update from Mrs. Henderson or maybe even a call from the police, saying they had checked the house and everything was fine. But her phone remained silent until 3 p.m. when Mrs. Henderson finally called. Sarah, I think you need to know what happened today, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice tight with worry. What is it? Around noon, David came home again just like yesterday. But this time he had someone with him. A man I didn't recognize driving a white pickup truck. They were both carrying shovels and what looked like bags of something heavy from the truck into the backyard. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Shovels? Yes, and they were back there for almost 2 hours. I couldn't see exactly what they were doing because of the privacy fence, but I could hear them digging. Then around 2 p.m. they loaded the shovels back into the truck and the other man left. David went back inside. Did you see Lily? That's the other thing, Mrs. Henderson continued. Lily got off the school bus as usual, but when she got to the front door, David opened it before she could knock or use her key. He pulled her inside quickly and closed the door. It didn't look like a normal father greeting his daughter. It looked like he was in a hurry to get her inside and out of sight. Sarah's mind was racing. Men with shovels digging in the backyard, David's urgency to get Lily inside. Rebecca still nowhere to be seen. The picture was becoming clearer and more frightening by the hour. Mrs. Henderson, I called the police today to request a welfare check. They said they'd send someone over in the next day or two. Good, the older woman said firmly, because I'm starting to think you were right to be worried. There's something very wrong happening in that house. When Sarah got home from work, she immediately went to her living room window to look across the street. The Kowalski house looked normal from the outside. Lights on, David's car in the driveway, curtains drawn in most windows. But now Sarah knew what to look for. She noticed that the curtains were drawn more tightly than usual, and there was a large patch of freshly disturbed soil visible in the small section of backyard she could see around the side of the house. That evening, as Sarah helped Emma with her math homework and listened to Jake practice reading, she kept glancing out the windows. She was hoping to see some sign of Rebecca, maybe glimpsing her silhouette in a window or seeing her car return to the driveway. But as the hours passed, the house remained still except for David's occasional movements from room to room. Around 8 p.m., Sarah noticed something that made her heart race. David came outside and began spreading what looked like grass seed over the area where the soil had been disturbed. Even from across the street, she could see him working methodically, covering the freshly dug earth with seed and then raking it smooth. This was not normal behavior for someone doing regular yard work in November. Grass seed planted this late in the year wouldn't grow until spring, if at all. Someone was trying to hide evidence of digging, and they were doing it quickly and under cover of darkness. Sarah realized that whatever the police were going to find when they came for their welfare check, it might already be too late to find Rebecca alive. The dog had tried to warn them, but no one had understood the message in time. As she watched David finish his landscaping work and go back inside, Sarah made another decision. She couldn't wait for the police to get around to their welfare check. She would call them again in the morning and tell them it was urgent. She would demand that they come immediately because she was now convinced that a crime had been committed, and the evidence was being covered up right before her eyes. Sarah didn't wait until morning. At 6 a.m., as soon as she thought the police department would have officers available, she called the emergency line. This time she was more direct and urgent in her tone. "This is Sarah Mitchell at 1247 Elm Street. I called yesterday about a welfare check for my neighbors at 1248 Elm Street. But I need to tell you that the situation has become more urgent. I believe a crime may have been committed." The dispatcher, Officer Kim Chen, took down her information and listened carefully as Sarah described the digging, the grass seed, and all her previous observations. "Ma'am, we did schedule a welfare check for today. Let me see if I can have an officer prioritize that visit this morning." "Thank you," Sarah said. "I know this might sound like I'm just a nosy neighbor, but I work as a nurse and I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong." "Everything about this situation feels very wrong." Officer Chen assured her that someone would be out to check on the house before noon. Sarah called in sick to work, something she rarely did, but she knew she wouldn't be able to concentrate on patients while waiting to see what the police would discover. She asked Mrs. Henderson to come over early, explaining that she needed to be home when the police arrived. At 10:30 a.m., Sarah saw a police car pull up in front of the Kowalski house. Officer Michael Torres, a tall man in his 40s with graying hair, got out and walked up to the front door. Sarah watched from her living room window, her heart pounding as he knocked and waited. David answered the door quickly, as if he had been watching for visitors. Even from across the street, Sarah could see his body language. He stood in the doorway rather than inviting the officer inside, and his posture was defensive. The conversation lasted about 5 minutes, with David gesturing and the officer taking notes. Then Officer Torres asked something that made David step back and shake his head vigorously. The officer gestured toward the backyard, and David's response was immediate and firm. Another head shake, then what appeared to be an argument. Finally, David stepped aside and Officer Torres walked around the side of the house toward the backyard. Sarah couldn't see what happened next, but she noticed that the officer was back there for quite a while. At least 15 minutes. When he returned to the front of the house, his demeanor had changed completely. He was no longer casual and routine. He was speaking into his radio, and his hand was resting on his service weapon. More police cars began arriving within minutes. First one, then two more, then an unmarked car that Sarah assumed belonged to a detective. Officers were now moving with purpose, some going to the backyard, others staying at the front door with David. Through her window, Sarah could see that David was becoming increasingly agitated, gesturing wildly and appearing to argue with the officers. Mrs. Henderson had been watching from Sarah's kitchen window. "They found something," she said grimly. "Look at how many more cars are coming." Indeed, the quiet street was now filled with police vehicles, and Sarah could see neighbors beginning to come out of their houses to see what was happening. Yellow tape was being stretched around the perimeter of the Kowalski property, and she noticed that one of the officers was photographing the area where David had been seeding grass the night before. Around noon, Sarah saw something that made her stomach drop. Officers were leading David to a police car in handcuffs. His head was down and he was no longer arguing or gesturing. He looked like a man who had been caught and knew it. As the car drove away with David in the back seat, Sarah felt a mix of vindication and horror. She had been right to trust her instincts, but being right meant that something terrible had indeed happened to Rebecca. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at Sarah's door. Officer Torres was standing on her porch looking serious but not unfriendly. "Ms. Mitchell?" "I'm Officer Torres. I understand you were the one who called in the welfare check request." "Yes, that's right. What did you find?" Officer Torres stepped inside when Sarah invited him, but he remained standing near the door. "I can't give you all the details because this is now an active investigation, but I can tell you that we found evidence of foul play on the property. We've arrested David Kowalski and we're treating this as a homicide case." Sarah felt her knees weaken, and she sat down heavily on her couch. Hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that all her suspicions hadn't. "What about Rebecca?" "And Lily?" "We haven't found Rebecca yet, but we have teams searching. As for Lily, she's been taken into protective custody. Child Services is involved now to make sure she's safe and cared for." Sarah thought about the little girl who had seemed afraid to enter her own house. "Officer Torres, I have to ask, the dog. There was a dog in that house that was barking desperately for hours 2 nights ago, and then it suddenly went silent. What happened to the dog?" Officer Torres looked grim. "We found the dog's remains in the backyard. It appears the animal was silenced because it was alerting neighbors to what had happened in the house." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. The dog had been trying to save Rebecca, or at least trying to get help for her. The loyal animal had barked itself hoarse, trying to alert anyone who would listen that something was terribly wrong. And when David realized that the dog was drawing attention to the house, he had killed it too. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that your call may have prevented this from becoming an even worse situation," Officer Torres continued. "If you hadn't been observant and hadn't trusted your instincts to call us, we might not have discovered this for weeks or months. Your vigilance may have saved that little girl from further trauma or danger." After Officer Torres left, Sarah sat in her living room staring at the house across the street, which was still surrounded by police tape and had officers coming and going. Mrs. Henderson sat beside her, both women quiet as they processed what had happened. "I keep thinking about that poor dog," Sarah finally said. "It was trying so hard to get someone to pay attention. It knew Rebecca needed help." "And you did pay attention," Mrs. Henderson replied. "You listened when that dog was trying to tell you something was wrong. A lot of people would have just complained about the noise and tried to ignore it." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah learned more details from the local news and from neighbors who had spoken to police. David Kowalski had been charged with murder, and investigators believed Rebecca had been killed several days earlier. The dog had apparently witnessed the crime and had been barking ever since, trying to alert someone to come help. When David realized the dog's barking was drawing attention, he killed the animal and buried both Rebecca and the dog in the backyard. That evening, as Sarah tucked her own children into bed, Emma asked about all the police cars that had been on their street. "Something bad happened in that house across the street," Sarah explained carefully. "But the police found out about it and made sure no one else would get hurt." "Was it because of the dog that was barking?" Emma asked with the perceptive intuition that children sometimes have. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said, smoothing her daughter's hair. "The dog was trying to tell us that someone needed help. And because we listened, the police were able to help." As Sarah turned off Emma's bedroom light, she realized that this experience had changed her forever. She would never again ignore the feeling that something was wrong, and she would never dismiss an animal's distress as just noise. Sometimes the most important warnings come from the most unexpected sources. The days following David's arrest were surreal for Sarah and the entire neighborhood. What had once been a quiet, safe street, where children rode their bikes and neighbors waved to each other, had become the center of a murder investigation that attracted news crews and curious onlookers from all over the city. Sarah found herself at the center of the media attention, though she tried to avoid it as much as possible. Reporters knocked on her door asking for interviews about how she had discovered the crime, but she declined most requests. She didn't want to be seen as someone seeking fame from a tragedy. Her main concern was for Lily, the 7-year-old girl who had lost her mother and learned that her father was a killer. 3 days after David's arrest, Sarah received a call from Detective Lisa Park, who was leading the investigation. Detective Park asked if Sarah could come to the police station to provide a more detailed statement about her observations. "We need to establish a timeline of events," Detective Park explained as Sarah sat in the small interview room. "Your observations are crucial because you may be the only witness who noticed the warning signs before we were called." Sarah walked through everything again. The night of frantic barking, Rebecca's absence, David's suspicious behavior, and all the details that had led her to call for the welfare check. As she spoke, Detective Park took careful notes and asked specific questions about timing and what Sarah had actually seen versus what she had assumed. "Tell me more about the dog's behavior," Detective Park said. "In your opinion, was this normal barking or something different?" "It was completely different from any dog behavior I'd ever heard," Sarah explained. "I grew up with dogs, and this wasn't territorial barking or playful barking or even anxious barking. This was desperate. It was like the dog was trying to communicate something urgent and couldn't understand why no one was responding." Detective Park nodded. "The medical examiner estimates that Rebecca died sometime on Monday evening or early Tuesday morning. The barking you heard Tuesday night was the dog trying to alert someone for over 12 hours after the murder occurred. Sarah felt a chill as she realized how close in time everything had been. If she had trusted her instincts and called police that first night when the barking seemed so urgent, might Rebecca still be alive? Detective Park seemed to read her thoughts. Ms. Mitchell, I want to be clear about something. Based on the evidence we've gathered, Rebecca was already deceased when you first heard the dog barking. There was nothing you could have done to save her life. But your attention to the dog's distress and your decision to call us may have prevented David from covering up the crime completely or potentially harming his daughter. This was some comfort, but Sarah still felt the weight of wondering what if. Detective Park continued with more details about the investigation. We found Rebecca's body buried in the backyard, along with the dog. David had been methodically trying to cover up the evidence, cleaning the house, disposing of items, and finally attempting to make the burial site look like normal yard work. If you hadn't called when you did, he might have succeeded. What about Lily? Sarah asked.
How much did she know about what happened?
Detective Park's expression grew even more serious. That's one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. Lily was in the house when her mother was murdered. She witnessed at least part of what happened, and she's been living with that knowledge for several days while her father tried to act like everything was normal. Sarah thought about seeing Lily at the bus stop, standing apart from the other children and her apparent reluctance to enter her own house. The poor child had been carrying an unimaginable burden. Child Services has placed her with a foster family that specializes in trauma cases, Detective Park continued. She'll get professional counseling and support. She's also been very helpful in providing details about what happened, though we're being very careful about how we interview her given her age and the trauma she's experienced. After leaving the police station, Sarah stopped by Mrs. Henderson's house to update her on what she had learned. The older woman had been following the news closely and was deeply affected by the tragedy. I keep thinking about all the times I saw that little girl and didn't realize what she was going through, Mrs. Henderson said, shaking her head. She must have been so scared and confused. Detective Park said that Lily has been placed with a good foster family, Sarah replied. Hopefully she'll be able to heal from this with proper support. That evening, Sarah's sister Linda came over for dinner and to discuss the situation. Linda had been following the news coverage and had questions about everything that had happened. I still can't believe this was happening right across the street from you, Linda said as they sat at Sarah's kitchen table after putting the children to bed. It makes you realize how little we really know about our neighbors. Sarah nodded, though she had been thinking about this differently. Actually, I think the signs were there if someone had been paying attention. Rebecca becoming more withdrawn, Lily seeming fearful, the way David controlled situations. Mrs. Henderson noticed some of these things too, but we all just assumed they were personality differences or family dynamics we didn't understand. But how were you supposed to know it would lead to murder? Linda asked. I don't think anyone could have predicted that, Sarah replied. But I think there's a difference between not predicting something and not noticing warning signs. The dog noticed. Animals are often more sensitive to danger and violence than humans are. Over the following weeks, more details about the case emerged through court proceedings and news reports. David Kowalski had been having financial problems and had taken out a large life insurance policy on Rebecca 6 months before her death. There had been a history of domestic disputes, though Rebecca had never filed formal complaints with police. Neighbors from their previous address came forward to say that they had heard arguments and suspected abuse, but like Sarah and Mrs. Henderson, they had assumed it was just marital problems that weren't their business to interfere with. Sarah learned that Rebecca had actually tried to leave David twice in the months before her death. Both times she had returned after a few days, telling friends that she was worried about Lily's stability and David's threats about custody. She had been trapped in the classic cycle of domestic abuse, afraid to leave but in increasing danger by staying. The most heartbreaking detail that emerged was about the dog, a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix named Max that Rebecca had adopted from a shelter when Lily was 4. According to Lily's carefully conducted interviews with child psychologists, Max had been trying to protect Rebecca during the attack and had continued trying to get help for hours afterward. The dog's loyalty and desperate attempts to save his family had ultimately cost him his life, but they had also been the key to solving the crime. Sarah found herself thinking often about the chain of events that had led to David's arrest. If she had ignored the barking that night, or if she had assumed it was just a nuisance and called animal control instead of becoming concerned about the family's welfare, David might have successfully covered up his crime. Rebecca's body might never have been found, and Lily might have continued living with her mother's killer indefinitely. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the arrest, Sarah was surprised to receive a visit from Detective Park, who came to her house with a social worker named Maria Santos. "Ms. Mitchell, we have an unusual request," Detective Park began. "Lily has been asking about the person who called the police about her mother. She knows that a neighbor reported concerns that led to her father's arrest, and she wants to meet that person. We've discussed this with her therapist and foster parents, and they think it might be helpful for her healing process." Sarah was taken aback. She hadn't expected this and wasn't sure how she felt about meeting the child who had been through such trauma. "What would she want to say to me?" Sarah asked. Maria Santos, the social worker, answered. "According to her therapist, Lily has been struggling with guilt and fear that no one would ever find out what happened to her mother. She's been having nightmares about her father getting away with the murder, and her mother never getting justice. Meeting you might help her understand that adults were paying attention and that her mother's death wasn't ignored or forgotten." Sarah agreed to the meeting, which was arranged for the following Saturday at the social services office with Lily's therapist and foster mother present. As Sarah walked into the small, cheerfully decorated room, she saw a thin little girl with blonde hair like her mother's, sitting close to a kind-looking woman in her 50s who was obviously her foster mother. Lily looked up when Sarah entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lily stood up and walked over to her. "Are you the lady who heard Max barking?" she asked in a quiet but clear voice. "Yes, I am," Sarah replied, kneeling down so she was at eye level with the child. "Your dog was very brave. He was trying to get help for your mother." Lily nodded seriously. "Max always tried to protect Mommy. Even when Daddy got mad, Max would try to get between them. That's why Daddy didn't like him." Sarah felt tears starting to form, but she kept her voice steady. "Max was a very good dog. He loved your mother and you very much. My therapist says that you listen." 6 months after David Kowalski's arrest, the house at 1248 Elm Street stood empty with a "for sale" sign in the front yard. Sarah passed it every day on her way to and from work, and each time she saw it, she thought about Rebecca, Max, and Lily. The house had been cleaned and repainted by a remediation company, and the backyard had been completely re-landscaped. But Sarah knew it would be a long time before anyone wanted to live there. David's trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to first-degree murder. The evidence against him had been overwhelming. Forensic evidence from the backyard, Lily's testimony, and the clear timeline that Sarah's observations had helped establish. His defense attorney had tried to argue for a lesser charge by claiming it was a crime of passion during a domestic dispute, but the premeditation involved in the cover-up, including killing Max and attempting to hide the bodies, proved that David had acted with deliberate intent to conceal his crime. During the trial, Sarah had been called to testify about her observations leading up to calling the police. It was difficult to relive those days, especially knowing now exactly what had been happening in the house while she watched from across the street. But she felt it was important to ensure that David was held fully accountable for what he had done to Rebecca and Max. The most moving part of the trial had been the victim impact statements. Lily, now 8 years old and living permanently with her foster family who planned to adopt her, had written a letter that her therapist read aloud in court. In it, she talked about missing her mother and Max, and how she still sometimes woke up at night thinking she heard Max barking to warn people about danger. But she also wrote about feeling safe now, and how she knew that there were adults who would listen and help when something was wrong. Rebecca's sister had also spoken at the sentencing, thanking Sarah publicly for paying attention when everyone else had missed the signs. "My sister died alone and afraid," she had said, "but she didn't die forgotten or without justice, because one neighbor cared enough to notice when something wasn't right." The media attention had been intense during the trial, and Sarah had been contacted by several national news programs and podcasts about domestic violence awareness. She had agreed to a few interviews, not because she wanted attention, but because she hoped her story might encourage other people to trust their instincts when they suspected abuse or violence. "The most important thing I want people to understand Sarah had told a reporter from the local newspaper, "Is that domestic violence often happens behind closed doors, but there are usually signs if we're paying attention." Rebecca was becoming isolated. Lily seemed fearful, and even the dog was trying to alert us that something was wrong. We all have a responsibility to look out for each other. Mrs. Henderson had become something of a local celebrity herself, often stopping Sarah on the street to update her about calls she'd received from other neighbors who wanted to know how to recognize warning signs of domestic abuse. The elderly woman had always been observant, but now she was more purposeful about it, keeping an eye on the families around her and building relationships with neighbors so they would feel comfortable coming to her if they needed help. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years," Mrs. Henderson had told Sarah recently, "and I always thought of myself as someone who knew what was going on. But I realize now that I was seeing things without really understanding what they meant. I won't make that mistake again." 1 year after the night of desperate barking that had started everything, Sarah received an unexpected letter in her mailbox. It was from Lily, now settled into her new life and doing well in school, according to the updates Sarah received periodically from the social worker. The letter was written in the careful handwriting of a young child, with some words spelled phonetically, but the message was clear. "Dear Miss Sarah, I wanted to tell you that I have a new dog now. His name is Max, like my old Max. He is a golden retriever puppy and he is very sweet. My new mom and dad say that Max will grow up to be a very good protector, just like my first Max was. I told them about how you listened when Max was trying to get help for my mommy, and they said that makes you a hero too. My therapist says I can write to you sometimes if I want to. I hope you are doing good with your kids. Thank you for listening to Max and for making sure the police found out what my daddy did. I think my mommy and Max are happy now because they know that someone cared enough to help. Love, Lily." Sarah had to wipe tears from her eyes as she finished reading the letter. She immediately sat down to write back, telling Lily about her own children and how proud she was that Lily was doing so well. She also told her about the small memorial garden she had planted in her backyard, flowers and herbs that attracted birds and butterflies in memory of Rebecca and Max. The case had changed Sarah in ways she was still discovering. She had always been observant as a nurse, trained to notice changes in patients that might indicate problems, but now she applied that same vigilance to her daily life, paying attention to neighbors, watching for signs that someone might need help, and trusting her instincts when something felt wrong. She had also become involved with a local domestic violence awareness organization, volunteering to speak to community groups about recognizing warning signs and knowing when to call for help. She always emphasized that people shouldn't hesitate to contact authorities if they suspected abuse, even if they weren't certain. It was better to be wrong about a suspicion than to ignore a real cry for help. Emma and Jake, now 9 and 6, had learned about the importance of paying attention to animals and understanding that pets often try to communicate when something is wrong. Sarah had gotten them a rescue dog of their own, a mixed breed named Scout who had been abandoned by his previous owners. The children understood that Scout depended on them to notice if he was sick, scared, or trying to tell them something important. On quiet evenings when Sarah sat in her living room, she sometimes looked across the street at the empty house and thought about that night when Max's barking had cut through the darkness like a desperate alarm. She had learned that heroism isn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it's as simple as paying attention when others might ignore a disturbance, trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, and caring enough about your neighbors to take action when they might be in danger. The house eventually sold to a young family with twin toddlers. Sarah made a point of introducing herself and welcoming them to the neighborhood. As she watched the new family move in their belongings and saw the children playing in the yard where Rebecca and Max were once buried, she felt a sense of healing. Life continued, new families made new memories, and the street slowly returned to being a place where neighbors looked out for each other. But Sarah never forgot the lesson that Max had taught her with his desperate barking on that cold November night. Sometimes the most important messages come from the most unexpected sources, and the willingness to listen, really listen, can mean the difference between tragedy and justice, between a crime hidden and a truth revealed. Max had been a good dog until the very end, faithful and protective even when it cost him his life. His barking had saved no one that night, but it had ensured that Rebecca's death would not go unnoticed and that David would be held accountable for his crimes. In the end, Max's loyalty had achieved what he had been trying to accomplish all along. He had gotten help for his family, even though it came too late to save the person he had tried so hard to protect.